And a lot of us who are fans of the books today, we thought that at some point. Why would I read a novel that has dragons in it, you know? Forget that.
À bas le ciel.
This is a very unusual video in many ways. Most of my A Song of Ice and Fire videos so far have been really long format. I think this is going to be relatively brief. If it's too brief, I might wait and attach 2 or 3 videos together. I'm recording this actually with no electricity. Natural sunlight coming in, running on battery power. We just had the power cut out here, and I thought I'd spontaneously come on camera and do some talk. I'm going to cover a few different issues, but all my videos are unscripted, but in this case I don't even have a bullet point list. I have, since the last video I made about A Song of Ice and Fire, done a reread of Feast Dance. Feast for Crows, Dance for Dragons, and I used one of the funky new chapter orders. You guys know about this. There are people who want to reshuffle the chapter orders. It's not worth it, guys. I'm just saying, use the original author's chapter orders. I guess I can say I did a reread of Dunk and Egg as audiobooks. I listened to them through a second time. That was probably because I was really encouraging my girlfriend. I have a new girlfriend to just do the Dunk and Egg, not to do the whole, A Song of Ice and Fire, opus. But I was talking to her about the fact that those really are kind of really useful key to the series. I got some fan mail from a viewer, somebody who's watched all my Song of Ice and Fire vids, asking me about Dunk and Egg. And it's interesting. There are people who roll with the series heavy, people who are really serious fans, but who've never read the Dunk and Egg novels, and that's a huge mistake. That is a huge mistake. Other things on my mind here, apropos Dunk and Egg, I noticed that the Boiled Leather Audio Hour, that's a well-known podcast, Boiled Leather, they put out their first really critical discussion of the first novel of Game of Thrones. And, I'm not saying that as an insult. It's critical in that they actually do criticize the quality of the writing. They talk about the extent to which Game of Thrones, the book, is not a flawless masterpiece. And I kind of felt like, I wonder if this is going to kind of usher in a new era in the fandom of people really talking about shortcomings in the writing, not just in the organization of the text, and not kind of minor things like people don't like Darkstar, people don't like some specific characters, some specific scenes, but they were really getting to grips with shortcomings in the design and execution of the book as a whole. The reason why I mentioned that at this moment is that it seems striking to me that George came out with these prequels in the way that he did, and in my reread of them, I really felt like the Dunk and Egg trilogy so far, the Dunk and Egg short stories, they were an attempt to revise the problems with A Game of Thrones, with the first novel, by giving you an alternate way to commence the series. And so I would broadly agree, the first novel, Game of Thrones, I'm not going to say it's poorly written. Some parts are extremely well written. The prologue is beautifully, beautifully written. You guys may have lost touch of that, but the books, they're so massive, they're not at a consistently high literary standard. But that prologue, the description of the trees swaying in the wind like fingers against the sky, the description of the equipment being carried by the men, and the way that relates to the overall, critique of feudalism that's found throughout the books. There are many, many ways in which it's incredibly carefully, incredibly well written, that prologue. But in looking at A Game of Thrones, the first novel, not the TV show, in looking at that as an introduction to the political, ethical themes, and in terms of world building even, introducing the series as a whole, it's quite poor. It doesn't work that well, reflecting the extent to which the whole series is really improvised. And I thought it was telling that when instead you start from Dunk and Egg, if you treat that as volume 1, it's volume 0. If you start with the prequels, that in a very shrewd manner introduces you to the major political themes, the major magical themes, and the rules-based system by which the fictional world operates. Among other things, it very, very clearly introduces you to the fact that dreams have a special significance in this world. The nature of dreams and dreamings is handled extremely well in those prequels. And it also gets you ready to look at House Targaryen as a house that is all too human, is deeply flawed, and yet in some sense magical. If you start with the Dunk and Egg novels, it's kind of impossible to have a standard fantasy novel view of House Targaryen. all the figures, including, the drunk in the bar, who we find out later is kind of responsible for Egg. And Egg seems to be just a stable boy, but it turns out he isn't, this whole scenario. All those figures, and that drunk in the bar is having, dreams that are of symbolic significance and so on. You really get introduced to the mechanics of the world in a beautifully planned way, in a way that starts you off in the very first novel. There's barely any magic. This is largely a kind of very believable, very historically real medieval reality, or even I would even say early Renaissance reality. But for a reader who's skeptical, for a reader who's interested in the kind of political content or social commentary or what have you, for someone who's not looking for high fantasy dragons and what have you, it's certainly drawing in that broader readership and saying, hey, this isn't a dorky story about wizards and warriors. It's starting you off in the shallow end in terms of the religious and magical themes, which, by the end of the series, in terms of the books that are currently extant, the religious element, the jihadist element, really grows wildly out of control as the series progresses. In the Iron Islands, in King's Landing, in Essos, the religious themes become larger and larger, as well as the supernatural themes. So I just say, broadly speaking, I sympathize with the sort of critical direction that Boiled Leather Audio Hour has taken now, looking back at the book. Their discussion of it, it's kind of all over the place. That's how most of their podcasts go. It's by no means a kind of thorough critique, nor does the critique even take on any direction. But it was refreshing to hear people who love the series sit down and talk about the shortcomings in how it was written. And ultimately, we all have to face up to the fact that this book was not written against a plan. It was not written against an outline. This is a series of books that are really a grand experiment in artistic improvisation. So much so that, as you guys know, it's documented, some of the prophecies were changed. One way or another, there was a version of a chapter with a prophecy in it, and then George, the author, went back and adjusted the prophecy to reflect his, later changes in the plot. So, there are giveaways like that. But George is pretty open about what his writing process is and how it all works. Okay, so that, I think, I've crossed off my list of things to do. Although, again, this is a super spontaneous video. I'm not really working against a written list. One of the big themes I had in mind in my last reread was the issue of whether or not revenge really is the kind of key to the morality of the book series as a whole. Quite a few people, including Sean T. Collins, but others too, point to the significance of vengeance and kind of claim that this one great speech from Ilaria Sand, her approximate name, the grieving widow of Oberyn Martell. The grieving widow of Oberyn Martell has this one speech dealing with vengeance and the cycle of vengeance and how it's kind of bad and sick and evil, and it's, in a sense, the poison destroying this medieval world. That is one position to take on the novels. But in my last reread, so again, in Feast Dance, if you really look at, for example, the case that Davos has to make when he's on the East Coast, when he's talking to the mermen. God, what's their house name again? Sorry, when he's in the East Coast to the North, he's taken prisoner, he's put in jail, and he's let out and so on. Sorry, I'm forgetting the house name out there. But anyway, we have this series of very peculiar politically charged dialogues. And when Davos is asked what his case is, what it is that Davos and Stannis can offer in trying to recruit these northern houses to support Stannis' cause, the answer he gives is vengeance. That's the only answer he can give. He can't offer them money or land, or he can't offer them much of a hope of victory. What he is offering in the wake of the Red Wedding, he is going around the north trying to recruit people to Stannis' side, and the only thing he can offer them is vengeance. He can't offer them much of a navy, he can't offer them, and he can't even offer them honor, in terms of a war being defined with honor, which is certainly another major theme in the book. This is ultimately a dishonorable and treasonous plot that he's trying to enroll the various houses in. But the one thing he can put on the table in these negotiations is revenge for what happened at the Red Wedding and etc. So that episode alone, you could raise others that have contrasting views of revenge throughout the books, but I think actually even if we just look at that episode, there is a real reason to question this approach of seeing vengeance as the dividing line between good and evil in these books. I mean, I think you could have a very coherent kind of semiotic analysis of the books that really looks at them first and foremost as a critique of feudalism instead, that this is really an attack on the feudal system and talking about the inevitable internecine violence that's created by feudalism. Now, maybe that's a little bit too broad, but I mean, it is interesting. In broad brushstrokes, I don't know why the people kind of avoid this. He gives us a world that, very much like the historical Europe, does contain democracy, but democracy is linked to slavery, which is, of course, true in ancient Greece, in Athens. They had a democratic system, but it was a slave society with democratic elements. I would also say, Venice is really not given enough credit in the history of Europe these days. Venice, for many, many long centuries, did have a meaningful democracy, and that included, actually, women could vote if they were the head of the household, which they frequently were, because men would die in war, and then there'd be a senior female representative of the household. So not everyone could vote in Venice. The heads of households, so a certain class of people, were voting and involved in a parliament, involved in democracy in Venice. But Venice did represent a meaningful form of democracy for many, many centuries. I guess you could say in the medieval world. Imperfect, but also since democracy were imperfect, it was a huge inspiration to people living in far-flung parts of Europe like Russia and England that at that time were just straight kingdoms and what have you. Many of them looked up to Venice, but Venice also was a slave society. They were at war with other slaveholding empires and slaveholding kingdoms, and slaves were traded there and so on. So, okay, I'm simplifying history. The real history of slavery and Italy's involvement of it and the changing position of the papacy is incredibly complex. Please don't bother to send me hate mail saying, but don't you know about this papal edict? Yeah, I do actually. But with all those complexities set aside, Essos is a side of the world of politics, the human experience, that does offer different, interesting, flawed models of democracy, but those democracies are linked to slavery. And Westeros has zero democracy, but also has zero slavery. And again, I think that is very much a dichotomy, that late medieval Europe, put it this way, those are themes that emerge from the study of medieval Europe, although, of course, there's no perfect representative of either side. I remember there's a comment in Leviathan by Thomas Hobbes that, the study of ancient Greek had inspired so many rebellions and treasonous plots and civil wars in England. He was just talking about England, not even all of Europe, that he said, we can truly say now, no other civilization has bought the learning of dead languages and literature at so great a price. I think he said at so great a price in blood. Those ideas of democracy from Athens, and again, to some extent from proximate examples like Venice, many centuries later, those did inspire and guide revolutionaries and dissidents in the in the dark ages, so to speak, and in the Renaissance and what have you, despite the very, very obvious flaws that those societies presented, even a cursory glance, even if you're just reading Aristotle. Take a look at Aristotle's Constitution of Athens. It doesn't take a genius to see that this doesn't represent an ideal. This was an all too human set of compromises. Constitution of Athens, by the way, you can see very clearly the tribal element of government that's almost always removed. So look, this brings me to another one of the themes I wanted to talk about here. In addition to the rereads I've just mentioned, and again, I'll just restate, I do think it's really important to read the Dunk and Egg novels. They're an integral part of the corpus as it now exists. They're canon, and they are better than Game of Thrones as an introduction to the world, as a first. And that's why I was encouraging my own girlfriend to read them. I really feel, even though their redeeming qualities are subtle, they really have a lot of redeeming qualities. I've also been reading some of the Thousand Worlds books. God, let me tell you, that saying from George R.R. Martin that his only interest is in writing about the human heart in conflict with itself, that is true, but we can say that it is true to a fault. A lot of his science fiction stories, a lot of Thousand Worlds stories, they are just about human sentimentality and nothing else. There's nothing else there. The story is just sentimental. It's just about human feelings, and the conclusion of the plot, if there is a plot, In some cases, there's no plot. There's just an aesthetic and wallowing in some emotions and some emotional turmoil, and then it's over, and then it peters out. Like, wow, this is a really sentimental author. And I'm glad he evolved past that. I mean, we're judging him, some of the stories we're talking about, like 1979. So he has improved as a writer. But boy, they're really, to a remarkable extent, a lot of his science fiction writing is not plot driven, and it's not even politically or thematically driven. It's just about, as he says, the human heart in conflict with itself. So very, very strange to examine. One of the themes that Martin is really interested in consistently from his science fiction through A Song of Ice and Fire is this idea of devolved races, devolved species. And some of you watching this video now will have first encountered my channel because I made the claim that Preston Jacobs had not interpreted a certain story correctly, that he had not interpreted And 7 Times We Never Kill Man correctly. So that's not worth summarizing. But that is a science fiction story where I was saying, no, the main turning point, the main kind of kink in the plot, the unexpected irony that the plot is playing with is that the people perceived as aliens are not aliens, they're devolved human beings. Now, quite a few people wrote into me to complain that this was impossible. And it's not impossible. Go back and read the text carefully. As I said, there are quite a few hints dropped in it. And if you don't accept that, then a lot of things in the plot are meaningless. They're kind of there for no reason. And when you do accept that, you say, oh, okay. So this was a subtle little poke in the ribs to the reader. Well, guess what? If you read A Song for Laia, which I had not read at the time I made that video, A Song for Laia is based on the same trick. And so for one thing, in Song for Laia, it's not so subtle. It's explicitly stated to you that the people they perceived as aliens are in fact devolved humans who were somehow cut off from civilization. And in both stories, in both A Song for Laia and 7 Times Never Kill Man, in both stories, the timeline is admitted to be incoherent. Like, it's admitted to be somehow impossible. So in A Song for Laia, we're told that this alien species appears to be older than human beings, to have lived on this same planet continuously. I think they say 13,000 years. Like that they have a civilization that's so old they couldn't possibly have been colonists from Earth, cut off from Earth. And likewise, some people wrote into me to complain that 7 Times Never Kill Man, the alien species in that, if you actually read the whole thing carefully in the Thousand Worlds cosmology, it doesn't make sense that they could have been colonized from Earth and then cut off from Earth. Right. Both novels, both novellas or both short stories, whatever I'm going to say, both play with this, right? And it's probably just because George was interested in toying with that idea. I'm sorry, one of the other novels, I'm forgetting the name now, it also talks about the fact that most of the crazy theories and rumors in this fictional universe of far-flung colonies being cut off from the Earth didn't make sense and were impossible, that it wasn't possible for colony ships to have reached that far within so many centuries and so on and so forth. And yet those rumors persisted. So we've actually been told in many different stories in the Thousand World Corpus that the chronology of how different species ended up in different places doesn't make sense or is mysterious or self-contradictory. Whether or not that's because he was interested in time travel or some loophole or just some theme he wanted to play with, or if it's just part of this overall sense of keeping the reader kind of off balance. The guys at Boiled Leather, they've commented that George's writing style in some ways resembles film noir in that he wants to pull you into a world where there's tremendous complexity and a kind of incoherence of information. You know, you get the sense of political complexity, you get the sense of plots and intrigues all around. But as in a film noir, where it seems like there are so many plots going on, there's so much corruption, you have the kind of ostentatious presence of police enforcement in a kind of typical film noir or noir story. But at the same time, you have this sense of anomie, of lawlessness, of aimlessness, of a world and a plot that's moving off in all directions at the same time. That's certainly something George plays with a lot in both the science fiction and I'd say in the first half of the A Song of Ice and Fire series as we have it now. Now, I am not saying that he does this to make puzzles that are impossible to unravel. I think aesthetically, it's giving you, the reader, the feeling that there is so much to unravel in every direction, nobody can know it all. And he said that explicitly. I remember one of the storylines where he's talking about the fact that there are so many space aliens, there's so much that's unknowable. That's the one about the hub planet where this guy gets abandoned and so on. Quite a few of the stories play with that. It's, there's no point quoting this stuff chapter and verse. We're just talking about general thematic concerns. In any case, in looking at this story, A Song for Laia, it's not so mysterious here. In A Song for Laia, these telepathic protagonists, the two main characters, arrive, and they're introduced to this alien race as aliens. And they conclude openly. This isn't in the subtext, so unlike Seven Times Never Kill a Man, it is very explicit in the text. They say, this is a group of human beings who have regressed. This is some kind of colony, and they compare it to, they say this is like a colony of human beings that was cut off from Earth, and then their level of civilization and maybe even their biology and their brain development regressed. That somehow these people are human, or they're a subspecies of human, or they're a deviant group from humans. But they're not truly alien. So I'm poking in this comment after the fact. Many people want to speculate that somehow the children of the forest represent a species of reptiles, something wildly alien or wildly magical. Although that is possible in A Song of Ice and Fire, if we're basically taking the view that George's past experience writing Thousand Worlds predicts the type of themes he wants to play with in A Song of Ice and Fire, then we should expect the exact opposite. Because again and again, people who are apparently alien get revealed as human, all too human. And that even includes Bitter Blooms, by the way. So in Bitter Blooms, the female temptress character, Morgan, alluding to Morgan Le Fay, she's apparently an off-worlder at the start. Whether that's just a human from another planet or some kind of other species, or we wonder if maybe she's an immortal or something, very long-lived alien. And it's in there in just one line. But it's revealed to us in the conclusion of that story that no, she's a local native of that planet. Because she says to the protagonist, I wanted you to believe this was real. She presents her with these illusions. I wanted you to believe this was real the same way I thought it was real when I first came here. And it's clear from that line that she's a local person, she's from that planet, who somehow took over that spaceship and can't use it anymore. The spaceship can no longer leave the planet. Whether that's because the person immediately before her was a true alien, she took it over, or perhaps she's the next in a succession of local peasant girls who somehow took over the spaceship in this medieval world. But the point is, if we're trying to pin down a pattern or a thematic approach here, the thematic approach again and again in Bitter Blooms, in Seven Times Never Kill Man, and absolutely explicitly, not as a matter of subtext, in Song for Laia, is that he presents us with seemingly alien and seemingly magical groups that turn out to be human, not just human biologically, human rather than aliens, but they turn out to be human in their psychology, in their motivations, in the explanation for the mystery explaining why their society is so different from ours. And in every single case, all of them, the purpose of this trope is a condemnation of religion in general, but specifically, above all else, the role of the Catholic Church in forcing the regression of modern Western society. So yes, it's faith in religion in general. In A Song of Ice and Fire, some of it could apply to Islam, or in theory could be applied to Hinduism. But yes, clearly above all else, that's the thematic focus and the political purpose. And I can't even say there's a link from Thousand Worlds to Song of Ice and Fire this way. It is the same theme. It is the same group of the author's tricks with absolutely the same message for the reader to pick up on. In Seven Times Never Kill Man, that same theme is played with, but in a manner that is so subtle you can miss it. But what do they have in common in both A Song for Laia and Seven Times Never Kill Man? Very, very clearly, the reason for the regression is religion. Period. Now, they're different science fiction religions, both involving, I guess, something like telepathy. I don't want to get into too much detail. In Seven Times Never Kill Man, there is a religion that provides this alien species, who are, again, really secretly devolved human beings, provides them with peace, order, good government. They have no war. As far as we know, nobody is starving. But they have a very simple utilitarian culture. They never achieve the great things that humanity achieves. Instead, they've regressed into these kind of simple-minded culture, and also even their reproduction is controlled by this religion. They're sexual urges, so they don't overpopulate. They don't have problems resulting from overpopulation. They live in an unnatural balance with nature. Okay, in A Song for Laia, very different scenario, because the relationship between the religion and the believers is predatory. That the God, in quotation marks, this religion actually does devour the believers when they're about 50 years of age. And it's explicitly stated in the text. Again, this is not subtext, not interpretation. It's explicitly stated in the text that they have no war and virtually no crime. They have very little crime, very little murder, but, it's said almost jokingly, they have a 100% suicide rate that everyone in the culture aspires to at some point after 40 years of age, normally around 50 years of age, to give themselves over to this religion. So both are very clearly toying with the same hard anti-religion philosophy that he espouses. Now, there are other science fiction writers who are seriously interested in this. I have not read it at all, but the Golden Compass series. The Golden Compass is a series of books, and the first part was made into a movie. I saw that movie. I wasn't paying that much attention. My girlfriend at the time was paying a lot of attention to me. I was literally on the couch with my girlfriend with that movie playing. It's a long time ago now. But but I was kind of trying to follow the movie, because the one thing that was interesting to me there was, here's a science fiction story that is really seriously denouncing the Catholic Church, the role of the Catholic Church in the history of Europe. Now, likewise, I do think we can say that one of the major themes for George in these Thousand Worlds books, and to some extent in Game of Thrones, but less so in Game of Thrones than in those stories I just mentioned, Thousand Worlds, George does have this view that the significance of the Catholic Church in medieval Europe was the regression of civilization, that civilization devolved in that period. And it's interesting, this features in, I think, all of his political and moral and religious thinking, George. You guys may have already noticed I don't, in general, like to make predictions about the book. I just think that's not a great use of our time and intellect in offering this kind of analysis. However, I'll poke in here. A lot of people would like to forget that they made videos or wrote articles interpreting the text as if the direction the story was going in was that Stannis would save the day, that the religion of Stannis, this bloodthirsty monotheistic religion that burns people at the stake, was going to be the savior for Westeros to some extent. And if you've read these Thousand Worlds books that so clearly have this very, very strong anti-religion message, anti-medieval Catholic message especially, you have to know that is not possible for our author. The progress of the TV show has left all of us wondering what is going to happen with Stannis' plotline. We have no idea really what happens next with Stannis in the year 2017 as things stand. However, it is completely impossible that the moral of the story is that people should rally around this religion that the author quite literally demonizes, and that his whole corpus of works prior to A Song of Ice and Fire makes very clear. The moral of this story can't be that for everyone to support Stannis and his monotheistic religion is the answer. On the contrary, it seems inevitable that just like A Song for Leah, he's going to tell us that religion is bad and wrong and evil, even when it really can offer you happiness, even when it really does have magic, even in these impossible hypothetical science fiction scenarios, even when religion actually does offer you an afterlife and actually does offer you happiness in this life, which is what we see in A Song for Leia, still he wants to argue that religion is evil. And in parallel to that, in Seven Times Never Kill Man, even if religion could offer peace and harmony for all of society, which it doesn't in our world. In the real world, it doesn't at all. But he creates a science fiction world where it actually offers peace and harmony. Still, religion is bad and wrong and evil. Still, it leads to this regression, devolution, mental deadening of man, and the regression of human beings to something more despicable than an ape. That's not subtle. Those are two stories that come down so heavily on that side. So whatever the final commentary is on religion in these books, we've already seen it with the Religion of the Seven. The Religion of the Seven started out in the novel seeming so harmless and charming. It's not harmless. It's terrifying. The danger that's lurking there in belief is shown to us by the point we're already at in the novels now. The fact that we may see it earlier on from the perspective of Sansa Stark as just so many charming songs and what have you, her education around the fireside. Yeah, well, there are a lot of things that teenage girls don't know and don't want to know about organized religion and what aspects of human nature it exploits. And then we get to see that when the streets of King's Landing are running red with blood. You have this major religious uprising and the whole bizarre plot between Cersei Lannister and the new head of the faith. We've already seen that play out with the Religion of the Seven. I think it's quite likely we will see a similar subversion of the Red God, of Stannis' religion, and quite possibly of every other religion in the storyline will get this same harsh treatment if we're going to look at George's past work as a predictor of what he's going to do in his present and future work. And to some of you other YouTube channels who actually had videos up arguing that Stannis was going to be the one true king and was going to resolve the plot, I'm laughing at you. You know who you are. Throughout, I think he subscribes to the view that Athens and Rome had this very, very high level of civilization before Christianity, and then all of civilization regressed and devolved, and people, in effect, became stupider, and their quality of life declined, and so on. Everything became more brutal and simple and stupid under the influence of what was, for centuries, an incredibly powerful form of Christianity that dominated the European mind, economy, soul, what have you. Now, it's interesting. I do not believe in the theory of devolution in this sense. I think it's an appealing kind of cultural justification that many people subscribe to. And I've met many people with PhDs who care about this issue passionately. And we have to talk about the history of Asia, too, in a very different way, by the way. If you look at Sri Lanka, you look at the apogee of Sri Lankan civilization and then a period of decline and devolution afterwards. There are many different civilizations around the world that had a period of self-evident greatness. And it's self-evident, frankly, because of architecture in most cases. There's great architecture, great stone temples, Buddhist temples, or, in Athens, great monuments left in stone, or in Egypt. And then you have a presumed dark age following afterwards of decline, devolution, what have you. Now, there was one professor in particular at University of Victoria whom I met and spoke to face-to-face a couple of times. And he has a PhD in ancient Greece and Rome, but he does both classics. But he really believed that ancient Athens was paradise. And I had done enough reading. I've read basically all the classics. I've read Aristotle and Plato and Thucydides and Herodotus. It's not my area of expertise, but I have read heavily in that. And, I'm saying to talking to this guy, it's like, yeah, well, I mean, I see why you feel that way, but... And he was so deep, this professor, he was so deep into this illusion of the lost greatness of Athens that... he refused to accept even that slavery was a problem. And he sat there and he trenchantly defended. He said, oh, no, that's all a misunderstanding. You have to look at this particular paragraph from Aristotle. Oh, no, the slave. He was really claiming that the slaves had a good quality of life and that slavery wasn't like that at all. And so on. Yeah, I mean, he was really, really a deep believer. And he actually claimed, I saw him claim this in class, he claimed that in ancient Athens, people had a higher quality of life than we have today. That's ridiculous. And he was basing this on archaeological remains of the houses people lived in, like the size and quality of housing. It was normal Athens. I was like, You know what else is really great is soap. You know what else is really great is not dying of cholera. But I mean, this professor was really, really deep into this, to my mind, science fiction view of Athens and Rome as having achieved its fantastically high quality of life and level of civilization. And then the Catholic period seems like this tremendous decline. Now, I've already foreshadowed, my view of this is that it's not true at all. It's very easy for me to see how people construct that narrative in their own minds. For one thing, the narrowness of just looking at the most grandiose city block of Athens, just looking at the most privileged class in the most privileged city in that period of history, is already misleading, right? Yeah, well, how was life in what would later become Prague in this same period? How was life in what would later become the Czech Republic during this period of Athens? When you look at this, when you expand in terms of the social classes you're considering, looking at the slaves and not just the aristocrats, looking at many cities, not just one, looking at the countryside, the sense of the regression really changes. Now, of course, I share, George R.R. Martin's sentiment that it's very regretful. It is something to be regretted that European civilization declined in this period of piety, and piety in a religion that I despise. I think that when you pray, you're talking to yourself. I think the Catholic God does not exist, and that many of the things the Catholic Church did, both in the name of empire and in the name of social order, are frankly evil, sure. And I would have preferred if during the Dark Ages, you can imagine how much better it would have been if instead Europe had been conquered by Theravada Buddhists. Buddhism is not a perfect religion by any stretch of the imagination. It definitely has its own problems. But in terms of sexual freedom, intellectual freedom, personal responsibility, and indeed ethical issues like vegetarianism, the treatment of animals, indeed the attitude towards war, the attitude towards torture. Torture is a huge feature of Catholic society, but torture was a huge feature of Roman society, ancient Rome. Look at the protocol for torture. In Rome, they would torture you before you were even questioned. You were tortured, not even to prove you were guilty. You were tortured prior to questioning. At the first stage, there was an initial round of torture before they even talked to you. So, anyway. Whether you were beaten with steel or wood in that first round of torture was actually determined by your social class, by your place in the social hierarchy. So if you were a man of high standing and high education, you could request to be beaten with wooden rods instead of with steel. Nice bunch of guys. Anyway, ancient Rome, ancient Rome and ancient Athens definitely had their own sense of barbarity. So I just say, broadly speaking, George R. R. Martin's subscription to a kind of post-apocalyptic view of, the lost grandeur of a prior civilization, very clearly a huge theme in the Thousand Worlds book series, and a significant theme in A Song of Ice and Fire, a significant theme that Preston Jacobs has expanded on considerably. This serves kind of two or three functions. One, very clearly in Thousand Worlds, less so in Song of Ice and Fire, it's part of his depiction of religion as evil. Let's just keep it at that. It really is part of his evaluation of evil and is part of his evaluation of medieval society as such. I'd also say it serves a very peculiar political function throughout. What does it mean to the people of Sri Lanka that they think of themselves as living in the aftermath of a kind of national failure? That they look back on these beautiful stone monuments, and which are fabulous, by the way. Genuinely, the ancient monuments of Sri Lanka are much more beautiful and much more impressive than anything I ever saw in Europe. I've seen a lot of ancient monuments in Europe. Really, they have these fabulous, fabulous remnants, both Buddhist and just aristocratic, palaces for the aristocrats. How does it shape their national consciousness? Indeed, their sense of ethnic nationalism, even their sense of racism, to look at themselves as the children of a once great civilization that lapsed into decadence. That's a powerful, powerful historical narrative that shapes how people see themselves, shapes how they see other nations, and indeed shapes how they see the role of religious ideology and other political ideology in their history. And likewise, I do think that George is setting us up for some payoff in that respect, whether it's a commentary on the politics of the real world or just a commentary on the politics of Westeros. Preston Jacobs has certainly drawn attention to some incredibly subtle strands the sense that there's the lost civilization of Valyria, but even the sense that there's the lost civilization of Croyane, the sense that there's the lost civilization of the Iron Islands. There are all these fundamentally conservative, backward-looking nation states. The Iron Islands is absurd, but it's very sincere. Those people see themselves as trying to get back to the old way. And there are several different versions of the old way. That's the kind of complexity he builds into this world, right? Several different competing visions of what their lost glory was supposed to be and how they're going to recapture it. The sense of political leaders now being in the shadow of a once great civilization that they have to resume. Certainly a major theme, and one that, this is a rare case when I can say, I really do not sympathize with George's approach, actually. I'm hostile to that reading of modern Western civilization or real medieval and Renaissance history. Okay, wrapping it up, I covered maybe 3 major topics in this video. Let's ask the question, do any of these really matter? Third things first. Yes, this issue of the lost greatness of a past civilization really matters. It's huge. And you see it even in the drama surrounding the Faith of the Seven in the capital city and this notion of them trying to get back to their roots and trying to revive something from the past. I think if you made a flowchart of all the players in the game, where we're at right now in the novels, how many of them are fundamentally backward looking? They're already in the Dark Ages and they just want to make it darker. They're not looking forward to something progressive and positive in the future that's better. They're looking back to a past historical ideal. Again, whether it's the Iron Islands or the Faith of the Seven in the capital city, this sense of a restoration and chasing after the spirit of the lost greatness of their fallen civilization. We see that from so many angles. And I think there are very, very few players that actually have a progressive or forward-looking ideology of any kind. Now, again, the exception, you can look at someone like Daenerys Targaryen. I think everyone, okay, not everyone, the majority of people seem to miss the extent to which the later books are an indictment of Daenerys. And we're not shown Daenerys the liberator. We're shown Daenerys who, as soon as it's convenient, as soon as she feels uncomfortable, is selling out her own principles. She says she's going to liberate the slaves, and she allows them to be sold back into slavery. She makes these terrible compromises. She makes the wrong decision at every turn. If you make a flowchart of the decisions Daenerys makes, it's like every single one is the wrong decision, teenagers shouldn't be tyrants. This is like I talked about in an earlier video. But I think it can be questioned in an open-minded way. We don't know yet. Is Daenerys actually representing something positive and progressive and new? Or is she offering something regressive? Because at the end of the novels as we have them right now, this is recorded in 2017, we don't have the next book yet, Daenerys ends by resolving that she's going to go back to her house words to fire and blood. Now, she makes this resolution when she's, dehydrated and hallucinating in the middle of the desert, and, she's got amoebic dysentery or some other illness like that. We don't really know what she's decided at this turning point in life. We have this major turning point. It may be that Daenerys decides that her function is to restore the grandeur of House Targaryen or to restore the grandeur of Valyria. We don't know. She may now take a fundamentally backward-looking restoration aesthetic of trying to get back to that grandeur, in part because her one progressive thought, the abolition of slavery and the creation of new forms of government, which included also in the lesser cities she conquered, before Meereen, that she tried to set them up with a new form of government. She said, okay, I'm going to assign these 3 people to rule in a triumvirate. It's going to be a little bit more democratic and equal. And then that collapsed, and they had civil war, and they ended up with a dictator, and then plague broke out. All of her experiments with new forms of government, genuinely progressive forms of government in the smaller cities she conquered, those ended in failure. So maybe she now will basically become a backward-looking fascistic conqueror also. We don't know. But most of the players in the game, most of the civilizations, do indeed seem in this way to be trying to restore some sense of lost greatness. So does that matter? Yes, it really matters. And is George critical of it? Well, he is using it definitely as part of his critique of religion. And there is no doubt that as these books have progressed, religion has become a greater and greater theme. Does the theme of devolved humanity matter? Yes, to a massive extent. I think basically what we're going to find is that all the non-human species within A Song of Ice and Fire are devolved humans. In a sense, the White Walkers are devolved humans. We kind of had that revealed already. They're not a separate species. They're devolved humans. I think, the others, there are a number of other hominids that basically seem to be devolved humans throughout the book. And that is a theme he played with throughout the Thousand Worlds series in a major way. I think it's a minor but significant theme in A Song of Ice and Fire. And again, that's maybe a little bit different from Preston Jacobs' emphasis on science fiction elements, where he doesn't want to believe there's any magic. But anyway, whatever. We'll see if Preston wins his bet when it's all said and done in his anti-magic perspective on this. The question of revenge as a major moral criterion throughout the books. Is this really about vengeance? Is this an indictment of vengeance? Or is this an indictment of feudalism? After my last reread, I did basically conclude that the vengeance-centered model that many readers adopt now, again, the guys at Boil Leather, they really champion that view, that this is kind of the ultimate theme overarching these books, is a kind of critique of vengeance and the cycle of vengeance. I find that less convincing. I think that would be as simplistic as saying that these books are about justice. Are they? Justice is discussed in a non-trivial way, in a really meaningful way throughout the books. But, I don't know, look at the plot line of Arya Stark. Is it really about justice? I mean, how much is this interested in justice? And sure, I'm still open-minded. I feel in a very fundamental way the books have a lot to say about feudalism, but what is it ultimately that they have to say about feudalism? One of the clear themes, again, this is, to my mind, kind of a stronger approach than putting the emphasis on vengeance, is that he's really explaining to you throughout how land ownership and advancement, the nature of advancement and land ownership in feudalism, force people to constantly engage in petty acts of violence and betrayal and backstabbing and civil war. That's very clear to me. But I don't think vengeance is the main point there. I think the main point is ultimately, like to put it in economic terms, is actually about land ownership, the structure of feudalism, and the fact that feudalism literally puts people in the position of constantly having to fight brother against brother, because that is the only way to inherit land, of, vassal rebelling against their feudal lord, and so on and so forth. That there are fundamental motivations for violence built into the system, because there's no other way to progress, there's no other way to find advancement, social, and in many cases, forget advancement, there's no other way to even hold on to the little bit of land that you've got, or the little bit of dignity that you've got, or the little bit of freedom that you've got, or to seek out wealth, or even just to avoid starvation. And it's a world where definitely, as the story progresses, there is more and more starvation. And now, at the end, we come back to my first theme, I guess, and that is the outstanding and underrated quality of the Dunk and Egg novels. I don't really want to say much more about that in this video, but I guess people who've already read a couple of the books before they encountered them, they're used to the kind of grandeur and scale and noise of A Clash of Kings. And then the story in the Dunk and Egg novel seems small and quiet and, subtle in its virtues. So maybe it's harder to appreciate if it's not actually the first thing that you've read. But if you've passed it up, take a drink of cold water to clear your palate. And really make the effort to appreciate the Dunk and Egg novels, because I think they are brilliantly introducing you to the themes and to the world building and to, the mechanics of dreams and House Targaryen and their place in Westeros, many of these fundamentals, and the critique of social hierarchy, which is already there in the preface to Game of Thrones. The preface to Game of Thrones beautifully showing the relationship between this young nobleman who's in a position of authority in the Night's Watch, even though he doesn't deserve it, and this poor downtrodden peasant with his ugly black sword, in contrast to the beautiful sword that the young nobleman has, this extremely expensive sword. The contrast between their weapons and their attitudes, and the poor man has experience and knows what's going on, and the noble, the aristocrat, doesn't have that kind of experience, but he has gallantry and honor, and it's a sense of gallantry and honor that gets him killed, that gets them all killed. Deep. I mean, that's all there in that preface. But in the same way, those themes the upstairs, downstairs themes, the ethic of command and duty and honor and social inequality. Those themes are, I think, beautifully and brilliantly expressed in the Dunk and Egg novels in a form that's not yet so big and noisy and magical, doesn't have any dragons, doesn't really have much magic to speak of, in a way that's going to draw in readers who think, I'm too cool to read a fantasy novel that has dragons in it. And a lot of us who are fans of the books today, we thought that at some point. Why would I read a novel that has dragons in it, you know? Forget that.
À bas le ciel.
All right, guys, that's enough for this video. I am thinking about sitting down with my girlfriend when the new season of the TV show comes out. Me and my girlfriend sitting down face to face and talking about and reacting to the show. My girlfriend knows the books to a far lesser extent than I do, so she would have more of an outsider's perspective and be asking questions that someone who doesn't know the books well would ask. And, you know, I'm a jaded book reader who feels that he already knows too much to really appreciate the TV show like everyone else. I don't even have a love-hate relationship with the TV show now. I basically just hate the TV show. I'm sure a lot of you feel that way.